The POI policy is still the same, right? Like
All
we
right.
checked in the Grand
So,
Auditorium group chat.
Yeah, the POI policy is the same as last time. So if you have any POIs for Hafsa, you go over to the Grand Auditorium group chat and you type POI from whatever team you're from.
Thanks.
okay. So, give me 2 seconds. Okay. Starting my debate in 3, 2. We will go about this debate in 3 different layers. First, I'll tell you what democracy and capitalism looks like individually. And then I'm going to paint you a world where capitalism and democracy try to coexist together and what that world looks like. And on the third layer, I'm going to tell you what the democracy and capitalism looks like in a real world scenario where it works individually a lot better rather than together. At first, let's look into democracy. What does democracy look like? Democracy is a kind of system, a kind of political system to run a country which is of the people by the people. That means people get rights. It necessarily means that it requires a huge chunk of individualism to make those decisions while voting for a person to rule or to run that country. It provides, it has the capability to provide equal amount of needs to people according to their need, meaning it can choose to provide free education to all people. It can enable citizens to debate collectively. It can provide an access to a large chunk of information to the people so that people can elect their own rulers, or people can elect, or people can make choices for themselves better. What does capitalism look like? Capitalism looks like something that allows corporations to play the market as aggressively as possible, meaning that in any corporate situation, any corporation has specific demands in a market from the people. That means a lot of the times, in order to sell a product, they end up curving down the line as much as dehumanizing labors to products. And the second is they also, the challenge for citizens in this case of capitalism is to stop these economic entities for being the authors of the rules by which they will be living, which necessarily in like cannot intertwines with democracy and cannot coexist with democracy, because in one hand capitalism does not allow the citizens to write for themselves what they require from the economic entities, but democracy itself allows, or in an ideal form of democracy, it should allow people to have access to information, and it should allow people to have individualism, and it should allow people to have their own needs. So what does a world with capitalism and democracy all together look like? It looks like countries as fascist as Russia, where democracy is a name only, allowing corporations and elites, like bought by like very successful economic corporations, to undermine the government's capacity to respond to citizens' concerns. That means these lobbyists, or for Russia, the oligarchs, have a huge chunk of power to make a huge chunk of influence on the government in terms of specific choices. Even for cases of USA, the major chunks of harms that capitalism put forward where they could not function a normal democratic society. Why so? When people voted for uh, voted to cancel out the right to bear arms from the constitution, if corporations like NRA fought for keeping that in the constitution. Why is that? And at the end of the day, USA ended up providing more money into wars and into building arms and not providing free education in spite of being such a developed, in spite of being such a successful country. On the other hand, we see countries such as like China, where capitalism and democracy does not coexist, meaning China is not a capitalistic country. However, it takes a true form of it does not take a true form of it does not talk about China is a capitalistic country, but it does not take the version of democracy. That means they do not say that they are a democratic country, which they are not. So it's better to have a country like China where people believe that they know that they do not have the right in every form, and they don't get to say. They rely on their government in most of these cases. So what are the main pillars of democracy, and why do you think that democracy is very much incompatible with capitalism? It's because it democracy necessarily means it should provide sovereignty residing at like a lowest level of authority, meaning every single individuals will be having a say on their needs. Secondly, there will be a large amount of accountability from the government in terms of goes on in a country. Thirdly, there should be representation and individuality as well. However, we see in capitalism, like in most cases, we see that there is a new liberalism in case of capitalism, which means there is a free market without regulation, where regulations can be bought by power, and individuals will not be taking a lot of the instances, or a lot of say in those cases. But why do we think, in even in the best case scenario, this two things cannot coexist? It's because it creates a false assumptions in people's mind that they are democratic. Let's look at Bangladesh. We feel like we are, at the end of the day, living in a democratic country, but we do not really have a lot of power in terms of choosing the rightful leader for our country. Meaning, there's always someone who is infiltrating the election process or infiltrating other avenues where we cannot rightfully exercise democracy. So it's a lot better to have a world where democracy and capitalism are put in like two individual spheres. And if a country has to be capitalistic, it explicitly says that they are not democratic in nature, rather than giving a world to the people that they have a say in every spheres, and like at the end of the day not getting to exercise that in all the levels. So what did we have in our side? We told you the difference between democracy and capitalism, and how in two different layers they themselves cancel out their benefits. And secondly, we told you why it creates a false assumption of democracy, and a pseudo democracy is a lot more worse than having a country that runs on capitalism and as successful as China. So very, very proud to propose.
Thank you, Prime Minister. You spoke for 7:30, inviting the leader of opposition. Here, here.
Am I audible?
You are.
Three. Before moving on to our comparatives, we think there are a few fundamental clarifications within this debate. Firstly, let's understand what do we essentially mean by democracy. Democracy, right? We think by democracy there are two fundamental principles of democracy. Firstly, ensuring enforcement of free will, and secondly, being the bridge between the ruler and the ruled, i.e., the state and the people. Right? For us to win this debate, if we can essentially prove to you as to capitalism is the best economic system which essentially caters to one, free will of people, and number two, make sure the bridge or the proportionality between state and people essentially is something that is ensured, we think we are going to win this debate. But before that, understand there has been a significant flaw from said government. That is, we got absolutely no comparative as to how, if democracy is something that is incompatible under a capitalistic system, why is it something that is better in communist system or in other forms of system? No comparisons or alternatives whatsoever. So moving on, right? So understand any other for us for it's from our side opposition we essentially believe if democracy existed in any other economic system, probably socialism or communism. Understand this the any other economic system we think there will be at least some amount of state intervention compared to what happens in a capitalistic system. That is to say, the point in time when there is state intervention in terms of probably taxing laws or probably in terms of supply and demand laws, then that is the point in time a person's number one free will is significantly more harmed compared to capitalism. But on the second layer, we essentially think the bridge between the state and people, to which capitalism is ensured, is something that is significantly harmed. But understand what do we mean by capitalism? From our side, we do not defend textbook capitalism. What we essentially defend is modern state capitalism, which has welfare states and other systems to reduce inequality to begin with. Right? Moving on. Right? So understand two things from our side of the house. Firstly, how do we make sure capitalism essentially ensures free will of people, right? But before that, one rebuttal. So if our government's best case is look, due to capitalism, people of USA, even after wanting no wars, the government is essentially investing in wars. We think that's something that is significantly irrelevant because the government of USA, regardless of what economic system it would have existed, would have significantly invested in war in the banner of state safety for personal profit. We think capitalism has very little to do to in terms of these significant policies regarding war and whatnot, right? And secondly, if you are talking about oligarchs, we think oligarchs are something that are existent in both our side of the house. Oligarchs remains under a communist system. Oligarchs remain under capitalist system. For them to win this debate, they have to show us why oligarchs are significantly more relevant in terms of capitalistic system, in terms of like carving people's free will and power within state lawmaking, which is something they do not. Their entire case gets framed out. Moving on. How capitalism essentially ensures two things: enforcement of free will and proportion between state and people. Firstly, within capitalism is the only system within the only economic system which gives you the right to, which gives you the freedom of to what extent you are gonna work and income and how you are gonna spend your income, right? That is to say, you have absolute liberty as to how you want to spend the entirety of your income, right? You can spend it in the most luxurious way you want, or in the most minimalistic way you want. We think these tokens of freedom is something that is something you never get from communism. That is to say, if there's a communist government or as other forms of government, other forms of economic system, we significantly think there will be state intervention to the most maximum degree. If this is true, that essentially means you cannot get the desired amount of income you essentially wanted. Probably things like entrepreneurship or other things are something that's gonna get barred. That is the point in time we essentially think the fundamental principle of the first principle of democracy, that is enforcement of free will, it's something that is significantly barred under any other economic system, which is something that does not happen in a capitalistic system. In capitalistic system, given the free market exists, you can buy whatever you want to what extent you want and use it how you want without harming anyone else, right? If this is true, we think capitalism is the only economic system that ensures free will. Moving on to policy rules and policies, right? We think given it's a comparison between democracy and capitalism, the significant sector of policy that comes within this debate are economic policies that essentially about things about housing policies, taxing, and things like that. If this is true, we think capitalism is the only policy. Capitalism is the only economic system where people get to interfere within these policies that given democracy exists, interfere within these policies significantly. That is to say, if there's a communist government, understand to what extent a citizen is going to be taxed, to what degree a citizen is going to have to pay mortgage or things like that, are something that is entirely decided by the state without any representation or without any consent from the voter or the citizen. If this is true, we think the participation of these people within economic laws are something that is significantly barred in under other economic systems, which is something that does not happen in a capitalistic system, right? But even at the very worst case, if there is some degree of state intervention within these laws, we think you can always, number one, have re-elections or referendums under our system, where you can choose further leaders, right? So on a comparative basis, we think in terms of enforcement of free will, and secondly in terms of policy people's participation within policy making. Capitalism on a comparative basis gives you the highest degree of freedom. We think the only metric that essentially decides which side essentially wins this debate are these two metrics, right? So on a conclusion, what are the things we essentially cater to? Firstly, we comparatively show as to why enforcement of free will is something that is significantly important for a citizen. Because understand, what makes us human are our free will to begin with. Your life has value because you want it to have value by your own actions, right? We think these are things that are significantly barred by when democracy exists with some other form of economic system. That does not happen in a capitalist system, right? So on a comparative basis, we essentially think free will and people's participation within lawmaking, especially economic lawmaking, is something that is on the most maximum level, is something that is ensured when democracy coexists with a capitalistic system. For the entire government to win this debate, they have to show a comparative or a relative model or a comparative figure where democracy is something that is far better off under any other economic system like probably communism or socialism. If they fail to do so, we think in no way we think in no way that government is gonna win this debate. We are very proud to propose. Thank you. Oppose. Thank you.
Thank you, Leader of Opposition, for your speech. Before that speech, I think Zaid has to say up
Yeah,
something.
just one question. Everyone who was okay with recording, are you also okay with live streaming of this debate? So I know the GovWhip isn't okay with it, but anyone who was okay with recording, do they have issues with live streaming of it? That seems to be a no, so everyone's okay with it. All right, Pratish, you can carry on.
Okay. Inviting the DPM.
I'm gonna start my speech in like 3 seconds. Just make sure. Starting in three, two. Panel. Today we're going to talk about the USA. We're going to talk about the Scandinavian countries. We're going to tell you how, on different kinds of economic systems, in one nation we saw the erosion of democracy, and in other nations we saw the empowerment of democracy. What do we stand for today? We tell you that state sanctioned capitalism has turned into neoliberalism, or if capitalism is allowed to flourish in a democracy, it takes the form of neoliberalism and it becomes a nation like the USA or all the quasi democracies that we have in the Middle East and in Asia. What do we support in this debate? We support economic systems like socialism or democratic socialism that exist in Scandinavian nations. What are the differences and why is one better than the other? So, in a neoliberal capitalistic system, you have governments that are basically catering towards big corporations. You have the existence of large corporations. You have the existence of billionaires. You have the existence of liberal taxation and tax reforms and tax breaks to the rich. What do you have in democratic socialism? In democratic socialism, you have an emphasis on public housing, on public sector, rather than focusing on the private sector. In democratic socialism, you have an increased amount of public spending, and that is the focus of the government, and not the laissez-faire big corporation economy that exists in the US. Why do we think capitalism? Why do we think neoliberal capitalism is bad for democracy? Using the metric that OO gives us, right? We tell you that first of all, you must have representation in the parliament in your legislation. Why do you think that representation is flawed when you have capitalistic interventions into the political process? We tell you, number one, if you look at the USA, the entire election process is controlled by money from corporate donations from lobby groups. Why is this problematic in a neoliberal capital? Number one, because many of these politicians get the mandate, which means their power entirely rests upon getting elected by the people and using their votes. However, they misuse the sovereignty entrusted onto them by the people to help corporations and lobby groups. What does that look like? It looks like despite policies being helpful towards individuals, these politicians largely favor big corporations. This looks like giving liberal tax breaks to corporations like Amazon while there are homeless individuals who suffer. Giving large tax breaks and allowing there to be tax loopholes within the federal taxation system that allows Amazon to pay $0 federal tax and not contribute a single dime towards homeless shelters, towards homeless rehabilitation, towards education. What does that look like on a secondary level as to why it stops us from representing ourselves? We also say that without this kind of corporate donations, etc., very few individuals are able to stand for election to represent the people. That means you're also stripped of your choice or free will that Aro talks about. What does that look like? It looks like people like Michael Bloomberg being able to run a campaign for presidency, but individuals who are significantly more intelligent and have PhDs in, say, political science will never be able to run for presidency simply because they don't have the required amount of capital. People like Andrew Yang will never be able to become president because they don't have support from these groups to go in and reach a certain number of people. So on our first case, we show you that representation goes awry. But secondarily, we tell you that democracy means that you get a freedom from certain kinds of external barriers, like you get a highest authority and autonomy over your life. What is it that erode in a national level? Let's look at the student loan debt crisis that currently plagues the USA. It exists because the government, instead of funding free education in the tertiary level, which is beneficial for the public and the economy in future, gave it off to big private corporations, many of whose board members make up of ministers and secretaries of the parliament. As a result, we see that this kind of neoliberal incorporation to these systems enabled these individuals to manipulate students and leave them with thousands and hundreds and thousands of dollars of debt, which means people got locked out of education systems to better their life. There is one level of economic upliftment taken away from them. Secondarily, we see that it creates a cycle of poverty. The old government tells you that you have autonomy to buy what you want, to live where you are, to maximize your income. But that is only if you belong to a certain group of people. That is only if you belong to a certain class of people. If you are a middle class white American, you're able to access the wealth of your parents, of higher education, etc. But if you're an individual who's homeless, your upward mobility in a capitalist system is next to non-existence because you don't have you don't have public goods to buy into to improve your life, which means you don't have the ability to change your life if you're not part of a capitalist system. Secondarily, if you're an individual who cannot contribute and gain capital, like if you are, say, disabled or differently abled in any form, you don't have the ability to work as many hours, or you live in an ableist society, you don't have the capital to go in and contribute and have enough power in the capitalist system to make your senator hear you because you simply don't have as much importance to them because you don't contribute as much to their campaigns, which means poverty is one of the biggest things in a social democracy. Poverty is one of the biggest things in a capitalist society, which does not exist as much in a social democracy because you have things because you focus more on public goods, public housing, public food systems, etc. One final issue, we're going to tell you why democracy is also bad in eroding democracy elsewhere. We told Dickerman talks to you about how the corporations would not probably invest in the war, etc. We tell you the entire reason why invasions of Iraq and the Middle East and many of these places took place because companies like Exxon, Chevron, etc., went in there and these secretaries also have massive shares over there, one for the oil, but also corporations like Lockheed Martin have defense contracts with the army, which means that they have constant pressure to ensure that there is ongoing conflict in other nations, which means that those nations are unable to experience democracy in its fullest form. We see nations like Iran, we see nations like Syria, we see nations like Iraq, where the entire invasion took place on a false premise. So what we showed you here is that the reason that free will is taken away from you because media, because education, because healthcare and health insurance, all of these things are controlled by big corporations that disallow you a freedom of choice emancipation to make all your decisions and take autonomy of your life. While that exists in certain nations, this has a broader impact in other nations as well, where corporations, through geopolitical powers, ensures that they get benefited while people in those nations face a quasi-democratic dictatorship and never experience the autonomy that they want. On those points, we believe social democracies are the way to go, and neoliberal capitalism must vanish. Thank you very much.
So
Thank you, DPM. Inviting the The deputy leader of opposition. Here.
I'll just take 30 seconds, I think.
Whenever you're ready.
Okay. So starting in 3, 2, 1. So the primary premise of all of the things DPM talks about is that inequality is something which is bad. We get it, but the problem is you have to tie it back with democracy and the fundamental principles of democracy. We don't think that democracy is something greater than like just reflecting your self opinion and voting for your rulers. That is to say, you can still have your opinion, and voting does not require a lot of money to participate in civil discourses, or voting does not, or education is not required for you to know what you want to achieve in life, or you to know what your political ideology, or for what version of good life you have on yourself. This necessarily means that all of the argumentation from opening government needs to have a tie back to the principles of democracy as to why a lack of investment in public service is necessarily and specific infringement to the rights of people in general. Because we can see that a large tax breaks can exist on any kind of economic system where the government takes policies to provide large tax breaks to corporations, right? That is to say, we don't see any reason why large tax breaks or these lobby groups cannot be a necessary governmental policy and an important government policy for the economical flourishment, right? So I don't see any reason why that is necessarily an infringement in the fundamental principles of democracy. But before that, some rebuttals, right? So democracy. I think that a large chunk of argumentation was about corporate lobbying into political systems. First of all, we think that supplying and corporations exist on either side of this debate. You have to give us any specific and robust kind of economic system that specifically erases the kind of corporation lobbying that exists on either side of this debate. Oligarchs or government authorities exist on either side. They can also be bought off. They can also be bought off by millionaires on either side of the spectrum. This means that oligarchs and the second government system exist on either side of this debate. But more importantly, I think they also talked about how representation is hard by large chunk of billionaires. We don't think so. We think there are a lot of candidates who have literally left the corporate money. Increasingly popular Elizabeth Warren or like Bernie Sanders have literally left the corporate money. So I don't see any reason why capitalism in itself requires a lot of money into the political field. Hence, you have to prove to us why is this necessarily an important contradiction, right? So the contribution from opening opposition is pretty simple. We think if you want to judge and examine the compatibility of democracy, you need to go through the metrics of democracy that must be fulfilled and value against each other. We think the weighing was absolutely absent in the case of opening government, because if you think about it, I don't see any reason why investment in public service is probably much more important than like people's income overall being taken away by the state and being redistributed to the property. To what degree is the infringement justified, right? That must be examined on our service debate. So first of all, why do we think that free will is probably the most important metric to judge this debate? Because we think that the reason why anything in this world is valuable is probably because of it has been willed by some human being, right? That is to say, we don't think that your life or any sort of utility that opening government talks about is in itself valuable or has value from a random epistemic faculty that probably assigns that value. This is valuable because we will it to be valuable, right? This means the fundamental principle of democracy is probably to ensure that people can maximize their free will through it, right? We show you under 3 particular reasons why it is possible. First of all, we tell you that capitalism despises state intervention in the market system. This is the only system where marketed actors within these characters can play out for their own interest. Market decides the price, which is often arbitrary in nature and not any sort of restriction on your income resources. This means that you have the most amount of arbitrariness on your side of this debate, which enhances the free will, right? But secondly, it enhances your ability to receive as much goods as much products you want. Why is it an enhancement of free will? In a society, you have certain prices to pay or have some sort of achievement to get in the society. You have to pay some prices, right? Capitalism makes it available for you. If you have the money, you can get it, right? The state, in comparison, in probably socialism, the state decides what you can eat and what you cannot avail, which is a larger degree of infringement than any sort of any sort of other taxation, right? In other forms of economic system, state takes away your hard-earned money overall. We think that even if OG doesn't come up with it, probably CG will come up and tell you that look, you still tax people, but you have to examine the degree of infringement of free will that happens on either side of this debate. In capitalism, we probably tax people to some extent, but in other economic system, you literally take away 100% of the money and redistribute it as your own dictation. This is an fundamental infringement on how you possess your liberty in itself, right? This means it is a fundamental infringement of liberty on their side of this debate, right? But the second metric that was absolutely not engaged from their side of this debate is the reducing state intervention in people's lives, right? We think that every political philosophy assumes the fact that you have your moral autonomy. That is to say, you can decide for yourself whenever you want. But state exercising authority over you necessarily infringes the kind of autonomy that you have for yourself in nature. We think that the primary purpose of democracy is to bestow at least some level of proportionality within those systems, right? Because that is the reason why you have only votes in democratic system. You have only opinions and referendums in democratic system. We think that capitalism enhances and reduces state interventions through probably economics. Why is economic an important part of state intervention? Because if you think about it, economics literally decide the kind of things you avail and the kind of position that you have in the global economy, right? This means that if it is specifically decided and assigned by state, there's a larger state interventions that happens on your side of this debate. Now, if you engage with OG, we see a lot of argumentation about inequality. We don't see any reason that why inequality is a metric of democracy in itself. Why is it more valuable than any sort of state intervention? If you weigh it against state intervention, we think that the fundamental principle of democracy of reducing state intervention is much more important than inequality. Because if you think about it, in any sort of economic system, some people will merge up as oligarchs, some people will be the rulers, right? But in democracy, we promise to make sure that we have a stable position. We think this stable position is only ensured by capitalism through making it available for a lot of people. They also tell us that, look, you have to have access to access to information. We don't think so, because you can have still government-owned media that literally provides information to everyone. But we also don't think that information is required to vote or to reflect your own reflection, because you have uneducated people who know what their good version of life looks like, who probably don't have access to a large chunk of media information, economics, or foreign policy, but they probably know what their version of looks like, and they can get opinionated with them, right? But second, we also talk about corporate lobbying. We also tell you that you can still hold your government accountable in any sort of democracy. Hence, we don't see any reason why corporation lobby is necessarily not a system failure, rather a production of capitalism in itself. They needed to provide us any sort of comparison in order to prove why is that important. We tell you from the very beginning of this debate, we don't think that reducing state intervention is any way worse than any sort of metric that is provided by the government bench. Hence, we think that we protect the most important value of democracy. Hence, we think that capitalism is absolutely compatible with it. Thank you.
Thank you, Speaker. With that, that marks the end of the first half of the debate. Now I'd like to invite the government member to open the case from the closing government. Here.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
All right, great. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Panel, we don't know what political system is better. We just know that at the core, when we think about the core principles of the socio-economic political systems of capitalism and democracy, we know that these two principles cannot coexist with one another. What do we mean by this? We mean that if they are coexisting with one another in the current status quo, then one of them is lying. Either the state is not fully democratic and either is authoritarian or communist or socialist. or the state is not fully like capitalistic, right? So that is what we mean in this debate. What is the most important thing which we are sort of surprised was completely missed out in the upper house of the debate, right? Like, what exactly makes these two beliefs incompatible with each other? We think that they are the core principles that they are founded upon. And if we can show to you why those core principles itself lead to a system where these two systems cannot coexist, then we should win this debate. A few things that I will be talking about, all my rebuttals integrated in my constructives. So firstly, in terms of the core principle of democracy, we reject the idea that non-state intervention is the core principle of democracy. We think that the core principle of democracy is giving power to an individual. That is the most fundamental principle that like democracy runs by. Why? Because fair voting rights and ensuring access is available for individuals to cast their vote and telling them that every single vote matters is the core tenet of democracy. And this essentially means that you're giving back power to the individuals. So the core tenet of democracy is that it ensures that power is distributed and every single individual has power in the society to make the decisions, because that is how much weight we put on a voting ballot. We think that capitalism, on the other hand, does the exact opposite thing. We think that it concentrates wealth and power to the absolute top of the population, and that is where the problems come in. Because recognize this, capitalism has literally created a world of systematic inequality. And this is important because this was not analysis that OG gave you, right? Because OG says that capitalism might lock people into poverty. But capitalism was a system that created poverty in the first place because it created the elite class. This means that capitalism as a system created divisions and oppressive structures within societies and meant that for generations, people would be locked into those specific class systems that they were born into, because it benefits the capitalistic society from having power concentrated at the top of the chain. This means that because we live in a capitalistic society, we have systematic inequality where we have wealth concentrated onto the top 1% of the population, and they control most of the world's wealth and resources. And that is something that's inherently problematic and goes against the fundamentals of democracy. Why? Because democracy exists as a principle to tell you that you are the one that hoards power, you are the one that has power in your society. But capitalism exactly does the opposite, because it creates oppressive like class structures and then traps you into those class structures that you cannot get out of. All those debates that we have about why poor people cannot climb out of poverty and the systematic reasons behind and like the systems that make sure that they keep like getting fucked over and over again are a result of the capitalistic system that has created those oppressive structures to begin with. So we think that if there is a system that has created these oppressive structures, then it cannot ever give power back to the people that it swore to protect. We don't think that that core tenet of capitalism can coexist with democracy. Secondly, we think that in a democracy, you need to have a fair voting system, but we think that that absolutely cannot happen if like there is a capitalist society, right? Why? Because corporations literally control your political sphere, and this is more than just this is more than just lobbying. This is literally giving direct campaign funds to politicians and controlling their political speeches. This is controlling news media to see what news you consume on a daily basis, which are literally owned by news corporations. So every single thing that you do on a daily basis is controlled by a capitalistic system, and you have no power in this because the capitalistic structure decided that you would be locked into a specific class forever. But not only that, it also said like if you have more wealth, then you have more connections, and if you have more connections, then you have the ability to shape politics, which means that the power to shape politics or to actually make a difference in the political sphere requires a lot of capital that most individuals don't have, and only the wealthy really have access to that specific power, which goes exactly against the core tenet of what democracy is supposed to be, as I already said, because it's supposed to give power to the individual. But this does not happen. Secondly, we think like I already talked to you about, owning like TV and news outlets. Like Rupert Murdoch literally owns almost every single news corporation, right? And like this one man literally controls what news we get to consume on a daily basis. This means that we actually don't have access to proper information because we weren't privileged enough to be born into a capitalistic class that would work in favor of us. And we think that that is severely problematic. Secondly, we think that capitalism in general has created oppressive structures to block out minorities consciously. Because democracy inherently tells you that every single vote counts, but capitalism locks you into like bad wealth structures. We think minorities are the worst off because historically the majority has just been able to benefit out of that capitalistic system and acquire a lot of wealth unfavorably, and hence they have more political power. We think that is severely problematic. But secondly, we think free will in a capitalistic society, in what world does free will exist in a capitalistic society? Literally every single decision that you make on a daily basis is influenced by a capitalistic system. What clothes you wear, what car you drive, what food you have, everything is what capitalism decides for you. You have no power in this. You think that that is free will, but it's not. The only reason that we think this is free will is because we have been conditioned to grow up in a capitalistic society with no alternative. We from CG ask you to imagine this. If there were a society that had no wealth inequality to begin with, or if there were a society that was not at all capitalistic and did not have wealth concentrated to the top 1% of the population, only then would we be able to claim that every single individual has power in that society. And we don't think that capitalism has ever allowed that to happen, because it has not only created the oppressive structures that stops people from getting power, but it also keeps people in those very oppressive structures for which they cannot get that power. And that is why we constantly keep saying that the poor are not poor because they don't work. They are poor because that is just how the capitalistic system has shaped and evolved and entrenched them into those specific cycles. And the only people with power in this capitalistic system are the wealthy, because they control politics, they control the news, they even control the food that you wear and the laptop that you're using to listen to this debate. We don't think that these two fundamental political systems or systems of like governance can ever coexist, because they fundamentally are like against each other and vote for completely different things. Very proud to be on the right side of this debate.
Thank you, government member. I invite the opposition member to start the debate from the second half of the opposition side. Here.
Am I audible? Am I audible? Loud enough. So I will be starting my debate in. Three. Is that one? No, that's OG2. Yes, sir. I will be starting my debate in 3, 2, 1, go. Now, understand that how the entire government bench strawmans capitalism to be understood as only neoliberalism and only neoliberalism as well. Such level of extreme characterization is something that we do not stand from the opposition side of the house. They also largely ignore comparatives of how democracy fares better in a socialistic government to begin with, because they do not give us any solutions as to why the flaws of democracies are treated like do not go as like rampant in those socialistic societies to begin with. Understand that what is the motion about today, what is the specific burdens of the separate benches. Understand that to prove compatibility, we have to tell you that that the benefits of democracy and capitalism by themselves when put together do not cancel each other out, and b they do not make each other's flaws worse, and in the absence of them they become significantly better. If they do not show that, then they cannot possibly claim that they are incompatible. Now understand that where the principal idea comes from, right? So the CG does a very bad job of explaining what is the principle of capitalism or what is the principle of democracy to begin with. They come up and say that the power to individual rights and everybody has equal voting rights, but capitalism is something that is very evil and it wants to have wealth, therefore it doesn't want to give money. It's a very elitist principle to begin with. Understand that that's extreme strawmanning and we do not stand for that kind of characterization. Understand what are these two principles to begin with. These two principles stem from the same social contract that you form with society and state to begin with. Why? Understand that the social contract with state gives you democracy. How so? Understand that the social contract is that you let go of some freedoms to make decisions for yourself so that somebody else can decide from you. That's how democracy takes your opinion and maximizes your freedom of political expression. Understand that the capitalism has the same social contract, that it takes some amount of freedom from you and gives you the maximizes your freedom of financial expression. Thus, it stems from the basic same principle, and they cannot tell us about neoliberalism and put dust in your eyes and deceive you. Understand neoliberalism. What is neoliberalism? Neoliberalism is the newfound ideology where there is extreme division of labor, there is extreme exploitation of labor, there is extreme manipulation of democratic governments. If I take such an extreme example of capitalism, this motion is no longer debatable. They have to come up and give us some amount of trade-off in order to make this debate an engaging debate. And this is absolutely embarrassing that they try to strawman this way. Now, understand that what is our main argument other than the principal argument that I just laid out right now? Understand what is our principle, what is our main argument? Understand that what we recognize from side closing opposition is that you do not have control in either state of governance, socialistic or capitalistic, like whether democracy exists or not. You just let go of some control. Understand that the main danger of democracy is that the main danger possibility of democracy is it being autocratized. And if we can show you that autocracy can that in under socialistic government, democracy has the most potential of being autocratized. That's where the point that when we debate this debate. How so? Understand that they talk about information inequality. They talk about financial you're financially exploited by capitalists. Understand that when a socialistic government owns the means of production and you do not have any private property, you cannot financially express yourself. That's the moment you become entirely dependent on the state for the amount of money you have or for the amount of privileges you have and everything you have. Understand that the state provides the information because the media industry is state sponsored. Therefore, the state has every tendency to become autocratized because of too much power consolidation. Understand what capitalism does is what capitalism does, it essentially gives you an independent avenue of exercising your autonomy. And what democracy does is it gives you independent opportunity to exercise your political autonomy. What you do understand that in their socialistic democratic state, the moment you come up and say something against the government, that is the moment you have the potential of losing your job. Understand that they talk a lot about oligarchs. Understand that are oligarchs are essentially taken into those specific governments, specific socialistic governments, because without their consent, because of the power they hold, because of their consent, they cannot run the country effectively. That's why we believe that that's something that the state owns. That seems, how does this happen? Understand, the state takes away money from the traditional oligarchs, and the people who stay in the state is somebody who the people who are in the state become corrupt, and they become the new oligarchs of the society. They are the ones who wants to oppress and exploit the society and the people, and they do not have any checks and balance of mechanism because they have infinite financial ability to control the people, and they have infinite financial ability to control the people. On individual autonomy, why is that important that you get to spend money? Because this financial expression is the key for your total bodily autonomy and total expression. Why so? Because POI from OG.
Please understand, not all people are born with properties. So in a situation where capitalism keeps fucking up that person's life, and there is no proper democracy where people's right or people's choices are being heard, what position that person stand in, and how do you save that person from going to doom?
Understand, what we tell you is that what a democracy has, what a democracy does is essentially gives you what a democracy does is essentially manage the flaws of capitalism, and what capitalism does, it manages the flaws of democracy. Why so? Because understand, minorities are fucked over in a democracy as well. In a majoritarian government, in a majoritarian form of democracy, in populist forms of democracy, minorities are fucked over. But the only way minorities can have some semblance of agency in those, yeah, in those systems is having a capitalistic form of economy, where they can economically get ahead and then amass enough political social capital in order to make their opinion matter. Understand, under socialism, since everybody's vote counts the same, and there is no consolidation of such political and social capital. What happens is there's an absolute majoritarian state which fucks over minorities without having any which screws over minorities without having any check and balance mechanism or any opportunity for the minority to come up and have any individual expression to begin with. Therefore, on the idea of dependency and maximizing independence, we believe that democracy is absolutely compatible with capitalism. Thank you. Very proud to oppose.
Thank you, speaker. You spoke for 7:30. Okay. I should remind the speakers to not use swear words, because it's bad for the sport. Secondly, it's a very bad. Sets a very bad example for the young listeners, like listening to this debate. So maintain some sort of decency. With this, I invite the government whip. Here.
Am I audible?
You are audible.
The GovWhip didn't give permission to stream or record her audio, so that's why you're not hearing anything right now. I'll turn on the audio right after her speech ends.
Thank you, Government Whip, for your speech. Inviting the last speaker of this debate, Opposition Whip. Here, here.
Hello, am I audible? Hello, am I audible?
You are.
All right. Starting my speech in three, two, one. Side government. Oh, sorry. Let me restart again. Timer. Starting in three, two, one. Understand this. Side government has strawman throughout this entire debate. Side government is like strawman throughout this entire debate. Understand this. Capitalism, in its very best case and its very principle, maximizes individual freedom, individual financial freedom, and its best case, it deters inequality by trying to maximize individual financial freedom, because financial freedom at the end of the day helps you get social capital and political capital, and helps you remove the oppressive structure that exists in society in the first place. Understand, it's what capitalism goes RE when there is the case of personal greed. When holistic good is when individual freedom is when individual success is considered is given more focus over holistic good. That is the time when oppressive structures that they talk about are created, and that is not the burden of capitalism, but rather the burden of the government, whose responsibility and obligation to the people is to control that greed, is to control that individual greed, and to maximize holistic development. And that is the responsibility of the government in the first place. In the case that it is not, that in complete oppressive structures like neoliberalism, when there's like when capitalism is used to completely exploit labor, completely exploit the working class and whatnot, we believe that it is completely unfair grounds to debate on, because that is completely indefensible for us. We need to debate in a middle ground where we have to consider we have to debate in the middle ground where we have to we have to consider the benefits and flaws of from both sides of the house, right? So, like, before moving on, a rebuttal, right? So throughout this their debate, closing government has consistently focused on media control, right? Understand, media control will understand the tendency of democracy in the first place, right? Then democracy does not ultimately will lead to autocracy the moment you let capitalism go, right? This was talked about by Sami, right? The moment you do not have, when you know that people cannot rebel against you because they do not have the financial freedom, when you know that you're the sole consolidator of money and power, that is the time democracy has a tendency to autocratize. And the moment democracy starts to autocratize, it becomes a complete autocratic form of development where the control of media is completely in the hands of the state. Therefore, in the hands of the state, which is even more harmful, because the state is particularly going to feed you with information that will probably help them be re-elected in for the next term. We believe that this harm of media control exists in both sides of the house. However, why is it significantly less in our side in the first place, right? In the world of the government, what you have is the single big government that is completely controlling the media, single big government controlling the media in the first place. They're so corrupted that they have absolute control over media, and they can decide what information they feed or not. Understand, in our world, while their capitalists exist and certain form of media manipulation does exist, we believe this is done by multiple parties, which ultimately checks and balances each other, which is to say people now can have access to far more diverse information than they can access in their world. And therefore, we believe any informed choice based on we believe that choices based on those diverse information that they get in our world is far better than this single entity of information that is the state in their world as well. We believe that absolute power will corrupt when there will be no check balance, when the government has no freedom. We will believe when the government has absolute control of both wealth and power, we believe the government will be corrupt in the first place, right? Also, like, our argument that came from that came from Sami, that they completely Okay. So going on to the opening government, right? Opening of government talks about oligarchs in the first place, right? Understand that oligarchs will exist. Our oligarchs is far more likely to consolidate power in their world because they don't have people under them don't have the financial freedom to talk against the oligarch in the first place, right? Because everything is state control. Therefore, the people are employed under the state in the first place. Therefore, if people talk against the state, people are likely to get fired, fired on the spot, right? Therefore, they do not have any alternative means of income or alternative means of gaining financial freedom in the first place. We believe this is insanely problematic and which is exacerbated far more in their world in the first place. And even if oligarchs don't exist, we believe that the tendency of democracy to autocratize because of the lack of checks and balance will make them the new oligarchs, which will exploit the people for their own gains and will not give any chance of checks and balance in the first place, right? Before moving on, POI.
It's never going to be an absolute power control because it's like a democracy. It's not an autocracy. Like, even if it is, we think government will still spend significantly in our welfare systems like they do in Scandinavian countries. What exactly is your world like?
Understand this. Just as I'm analyzed before, right? Even if democracy exists, what you will get is like a wheel of democracy, and the wheel of democracy in your world in the first place. Right? You're going to get is essentially a world where the government, now that it has power, even if it is democratic, will exert certain far more levels of control over the people when it comes to their voting choices, when it comes to their voting decision. The people will still live in fear of government because they know that now, since they're working for the government, if they say anything against the government, they will lose their political will or financial. They will lose their only source of income in the first place. We believe this checks and balance, this individual freedom that people have, individual political will, is completely negated because of fear of the government, because they have no other financial means of income in the first place, right? And again, a huge chunk of our debate argument, which was on this, understand this, something that opening opposition said, right? Uh, Understand that opening opposition said, right? Understand that they have about free will, right? Understand that in our world, free will is preserved much better. How so? Understand throughout the opening government's case, their idea of free will is just political free will, like voting, right? Understand free will doesn't mean voting. Understand free will means the exercise of your financial capital. We believe the exercise of financial capital is associated with individuality, with one's personal freedom, and we believe this is incredibly important for individuals to be able to exercise this freedom, right? When we're talking about democracy, when CG is talking about democracy is empowering the people, we tell you that in your world, people are far more deprived because they don't have the ability to they do not have the ability for financial freedom in the first place. And thirdly, understand that in a populist government, if capitalism does not exist, this government are far more likely to screw over minorities in the first place because they do not have any checks and balance. The minorities do not have any other way to get financially empowered, get political and social capital because of having financial empowerment. We believe for the minorities to break through the opposing section, this financial power is importantly necessary. That will not exist in therefore we win this debate. Thank you very much. Very, very.
Thank you, opposition whip. This marks the end of the debate. We'll uh, go to another channel to discuss. You guys can wait here and I'll announce the verdict. Yeah.